Hello, are we ready to start? Welcome to the 2025 Seoul International Writers Festival. My name is Youn and I'll be your moderator today. I study modern and contemporary European literature and I also write criticism on contemporary Korean literature. It's a great honor to be here with you and to moderate this session with writers Geum-yi and Jonas, Hassen, Khemiri. A quick housekeeping announcement before we start. We provide simultaneous interpretation in English and Korean today. So that's why everybody's got a receiver to listen to the interpretation either in Korean or in English. And due to interpretation, there may be a slight time lag for the questions and answers to be conveyed back and forth in full, so we do ask for your understanding. Today's talk is also being live streamed on the LTI Korea's YouTube channel, so please select your preferred language and join through the link. And if you're joining us on YouTube, please drop your questions and comments in the chat and we'll be able to discuss them together during the Q&A session later. So it is great to see so many of you in the audience here today, and it makes me quite nervous, to be honest. So let us now get started. The theme of the 2025 Seoul International Writers Festival is Something Meets the Eye. So for this conversation with Geum-yi and Jonas Hassen Khemiri, this is the theme that we've got, more entangled than meets the eye. So we'll be discussing this theme with our two authors today. It's a pleasure to have you today. Good afternoon. Good to see you. Please say a few words of greeting to our audience here today. Let's start with you, Jonas, seeing as you have come a long way to join us today. So please say a few words of greeting.
I'm very happy to be here. My name is Jonas Hassen Khemiri. I have been here for about 48 hours. My body thinks that it is 3 a.m. in the morning, so I'm very happy to be awake. It's a great honor to be here to talk to you and to share some about my writing. And I also want to say thank you to the amazing interpreters who will make sure that my words reach your ears in Korean.
Thank you very much, Jonas. I don't think that it will take you 2 hours to completely get over your jet lag, but I hope you get over it nonetheless. So next up, let's hear from you, Geum-yi. Hello, everybody. Good to see you. On a weekend, Saturday afternoon no less, thank you for taking time out to be here with us today, and many thanks to Jonas for joining us and coming a very long way to be here. It's a great honor for me to join you for this conversation as well, and many thanks to our moderator for putting in so much effort into preparing this event. Thank you. Thank you very much. Please give a warm round of applause to our two writers. So, before we dive into our conversation, I'd like to introduce our authors today. Writer Geum-yi began her career in 1984, which is known as the period of new exploration in Korean children's literature. She has since published over 50 books, and for more than 40 years, she has helped lead the growth of children's literature and the birth of young adult literature in Korea, capturing the hearts of both readers and critics alike. And she has received numerous awards, including Socheon Literary Award, the Youn Literary Award, and the Korean Culture and Arts Award. Last year, in 2024, she was shortlisted for the Hans Christian Andersen Award in the author category. That was a quick introduction to Geum-yi. Next, let me introduce Sweden's Jonas Hassen Khemiri. He debuted in 2003 with the publication of the novel Red Eye. His works have been translated and published in more than 35 languages or countries. And in addition to many major international literary prizes, he has been a 3-time finalist for Sweden's most prestigious literary award, the August Prize, winning it once, and he's currently based in New York USA, where he teaches creative writing at New York University. And I actually got here very early today before the rehearsal. And we just found out that his work, The Sisters, has been longlisted for the 2025 Booker Prize. So many congratulations to Jonas. That is a wonderful news. So this is my first time taking part in this festival as a moderator. This is the 14th edition of the Seoul International Writers Festival. And until last year, I was actually in the audience to listen to some of my favorite authors. So being up on the stage for the very first time as a moderator makes me quite nervous. So up until last year, I participated as a reader, an audience member, and I remember feeling so excited to meet the writers that I'd only met on page. Of course, we are consciously aware of the distance or the mode of encounter as we encounter writers on the page. We know that they exist somewhere in the world outside of those pages, but at the same time, we make connections through the medium of language. But even so, I couldn't help but rush to meet some of my favorite authors here at the Seoul International Writers Festival, partly because I wanted to get some insight into their literary world, but at the same time, I just simply wanted to hear directly from some of my favorite authors in person and meet them up close. So, to meet these authors directly in person and up close and share a friendly sense of connection and camaraderie within the common space of literature is what everybody here is looking for. So before we move into a deeper discussion of your writing, I'd like to ease us in with a lighter, perhaps more question to set the mood. So first, a question for you, Geum-yi. You recently published, about a month ago, a book titled The Gap of Sorrow, so congratulations first of all. And today we'll focus very much on the picture bride, which is the one that I'm holding right now. And along with the picture bride, The Gap of Sorrow, these are each in their own right an independent work of their own, but back in 2024 you published Can I Go Instead, which marked the start of your Women's Diaspora trilogy. So about a month ago you completed your Women's Diaspora trilogy, and I imagine that you've been able to get some rest since then. And maybe you started a new project altogether, but tell us a little bit about what you've been up to. So when you have this work, your idea within your heart, then it's intangible, and you have to get it out of your heart, not knowing how successful it will be or where it will lead you. So you feel rather nervous as you go into writing. But right now, as for how I feel a sense of relief that I was able to release the story that I had carried inside me. So this is not exactly a dramatic sense of joy. Rather, I feel a sense of relief, like I said, and I am very glad that I kept a promise to myself, which was to write a trilogy based on the Japanese colonial era. So I feel an enormous sense of fulfillment and pride. So a promise that you make to yourself, I think, as a writer, is a driving force that pushes you forward, I think, and one of the most powerful driving forces as well compared to any other external forces. So let's turn to novelist Jonas Hassen Khemiri, who has come a long way to join us. You just said that this is 3 a.m. in the morning for you, and you're still a little jet-lagged. And I'm very curious about what you've been up to, but at the same time, you teach creative writing, as I understand, at university. So how do you juggle these two different roles, being a writer and being a teacher?
Question. Thank you very much. One of the reasons why I like to teach is I think it gives me courage. I think it gives me creative courage to teach. I hope it gives me creative courage to teach. Because when I teach, I'm close to young people who are constantly trying something new. They might be failing, and they might try something that doesn't work, but they're constantly trying and experimenting. And as a writer, I published my first book 22 years ago, so I've been writing for a long time. To just be close to young minds who are actively trying new things is actually amazing. Another thing, when I teach, I have to practice and you know this as well, like as a creative person, I have to practice my kindness. Because in order to create anything, we have to be quite kind to ourselves once we write our early drafts. Because the early first drafts are always bad. So you have to be kind enough to say, okay, that's the current state of affairs, but we will hopefully get somewhere soon. So I practice that with my students, and I find that if I'm kind to my students, it's easier to be kind to myself. It was interesting to hear what you said about like seeing writers in person, because when I was young, I grew up in a household in Stockholm, Sweden, where we had a lot of library books. We always went to the library with these like big blue IKEA bags, you know, like huge bags. And my mom would always say, like the big bag.
Yes, of course, we know those bags.
Yes. And my mom, we would go to the library, and my mom would always say, go crazy. Like, you can pick anything you want. And I would like just borrow so many books. But I didn't grow up in a house, so the book was valued, but I didn't grow up in a household where I actually understood that there were actual people behind these books. So I remember the first time when I met a person who was actually published, it almost felt like meeting a ghost somehow. It was so special when I realized that the words that had influenced me and that I had been carrying around and that had actually, our theme today is vision, I had read words that had changed the way I saw the world, which is remarkable, that those words came from an actual person. I remember it felt spooky. I was working in a clothing store at the time, and one of those writers, I can share his name, is a Swedish writer called Peter Kilgård. He entered the store, and it was the first time I saw an actual writer. And I remember I was like, I wanted to like touch him, like, because I wanted to, like, he's actually for real. And then you know when you get so nervous that you start to sweat all over your body? That's what happened to me. I was like sweating all over, and then I was folding a shirt like close to him, you know, trying to say something. And just as he was leaving, I just told him, like, Peter, I have to tell you, like, I read your book, and it was a book called, in Swedish, it's called Anvisningar till en far. It's a beautiful book about a portrait of a dying father. And I remember telling him this, like, I love your book. And I remember thinking that he would look at me and go like, yeah, of course it's good. You know, of course, I'm a writer, what do you think? But instead he looked at me and he was so happy. He was like, thank you very much. It makes me very happy. And then he left, and then I just stood there like, wow, I spoke to a writer. And then he came back, like 10 minutes later, and he said, you know that thing you told me? It just made my day, you know. And then he left. So like the experience of having had words change the way I see the world, that was real, but it took me a long time to realize that there were actual people behind those words. Yeah, so it makes me very happy to be here with you in person. Yeah.
너무 감동. That is such a touching story. I almost forgot that I was here to moderate and started laughing like crazy, but you know that, so I feel rather embarrassed right now. Here in Korea, when we have a literary event, about the majority of people in the audience are people in their 20s and 30s, aspiring writers, writers attending creative classes. So what you've just told us about being kind or gaining courage in the classroom from your students, I think really strikes a chord with them, and how being kind to your students helps you be kind to yourself as well as a writer. I think that is such a resonant message to all of us here, and I'm sure that it gives them courage as well. And about that little anecdote of what happened when you met a real writer for the first time, I didn't expect that to hear that from you, but it was really entertaining. Thank you so much. So let us now delve into our questions.
So when I first saw this motto, 보이는 것보다, or something meets the eye, I think that it could be read in at least two ways in Korean. That's where I came to focus. So if you write it with a space, 보이는 것보다, it can work as a verb phrase, meaning to look at something placed before the eyes without being conscious about it. So you're just looking at something that is right before your eyes in an unconscious way. So that's how it can be understood as, but reading it without the space, 보이는 것보다, it becomes another meaning. So you are making a comparison. So something that is smaller, that is more beautiful, or maybe something that is more fake than I had thought, or maybe it is something that is more true than I had thought. So there is a comparative nuance that comes in. So if you think that the act of 보다 is like a verb, to see, so it is simply a matter of passively registering what falls on your retina, but rather, I don't think that is the way. It is an active gesture of drawing closer and taking something in. So something that you see in front of you that goes beyond your level of psychological sensation, but it is sort of welcomed inside into your perception, into your life. So something that is outside is welcomed in your life. Of course, that welcome may destroy you, but we never stop to pursue it. So this is how I interpreted the theme, but I would like to know how our authors thought about our session's theme. So Geum-yi and Jonas, Hassen, Khemiri are joining us here with us, and the title of our conversation is More Entangled Than Meets the Eye. So if that is the case, what we see in front of us could be more entangled than we had imagined, more knotted with one another, entangled in a knot than we had expected. And of course, from the word entangled, we can reflect that even among things and beings that at first glance seem to exist independently with no connection, there are in fact dynamic relations that complement one another, collide and contend, and in doing so transform each other. So this kind of dynamic could exist. So based on the theme or title of our conversation, our writers come from different nationalities, different backgrounds, and different experiences and different historical backgrounds. And not only our writers, but also the audience who are joining us today, there could be new kinds of entanglements that could unfold during today's conversation. So, when you first heard about today's title of our session, The Entanglement, I want to know what you thought about, what came to your mind. Can you share your thoughts? First of all, let me turn it over to Geum-yi. Yes, I think I can really feel the depth of your remarks about our title, so I just wonder what I have to add to that. But when I first heard about the theme for today's talk, it felt very familiar and natural to me, because being a writer, in many ways, is about creating countless entanglement in terms of the figures or the stories within the novel. So I believe that the writers are very accustomed to making these entanglements in our creative process. So when I first heard the topic, I found it to be very familiar. And as our moderator said, although we're here seeing each other for the first time, I think that we have been already entangled through the medium of books. And the books that I have written talk about the generations that were way, way before mine. So by doing so, we can experience the entanglement between different generations and also different entanglements in terms of ethnicity and different populations. So since I am a writer, I would like to say that the theme was very familiar to me and natural to me, and I very much look forward to weaving yet another kind of entanglement here today. And also together with Jonas, I've written your books in advance, and while reading your books, well, actually when I wrote books based on my research of my previous generations, but I think that Jonas had a great sense of depicting the lives of our times and his lived experience. So although we have lived different worlds and acquired different experiences, I think that through today's encounter, we'll be able to create new and refreshed entanglements among us. And in that sense, I hope that we'll be also able to think about some forward entanglements together with the audience today. Now, Jonas, when you first heard about the word entanglement for the title, what did you think?
I thought about what happens when I read a book and love it, and what happens when that book moves from the page to Netflix or to movie. So it moves from being words and to becoming images. And very often I feel disappointed because I love the book, but the movie is less moving to me. And I've had that experience with books I love, but I've also had it with my own books, writing the book thinking this is one thing, and then I see a movie version and feeling like, ugh. It's my story, but when it became images, something died, something disappeared. And I thought a lot about that. What happens when we move from a world of words to images. And why oftentimes when we move to images, it feels flat. It lacks some of the entanglement and the nuance and the messiness that I find in the books that I love. The reason why my favorite books are my favorite books is because they feel lifelike, and they are messy, and they are full of conflicting truths. It's hard to turn conflicting truths into images without flattening them. So I think that might be one of the many links between our work, how images play a role in our work and how we try to take an image and deepen them by writing stories about them. One of the reasons why I became a writer is because I've always felt that the simplified world around me, we're being bombarded with messages that tell us that the world is black and white, very simple, very flat. And that's not true. I don't believe that the world is flat. I mean, not literally, but like that I don't believe that truth is simple. So what can you do then? Well, you can write stories that complicate truth, that show that things are much more messy than we like to think. And that's part of the reason why I love writing so much, that it's, especially in the novel, is the form where you can introduce so much nuance, and you can introduce complexity in a way that I haven't been able to find in other forms. So I'm a novelist at heart, but I also write theater plays, and I've written for movies and short stories. But my real job, if you're going to ask me where my heart is, the form that has changed my vision the most is definitely the novel. So that's my real job. And one of the things I could tell to students, if we have students in the audience who are writing, one of the things that I found really helpful for me is to have one core form, the form that has changed you, that you love the most, but then develop, like, what would you call them, like side hustles, or like, I actually think of them almost like I'm being unfaithful to my real job, just in order to remember how fun it is to write. So for example, sometimes when I get stuck in a novel, I write a play, a theater play. I don't really care about theater the way I care about books. But it's great to have a form where you can alleviate some of the pressure. So that's oftentimes when I work with students, I try to tell them, like, you have your main form. I think you should be writing in the form that you love the most and that has changed your life the most. And then you can develop other forms where you can go just to, like let loose and play and have fun. So that's why my writing consists of many different forms, but the main form that I love the most is the novel, because I think you can introduce so much complexity and entanglement in that form.
네, 두 분 작가님.
Thank you very much, Jonas and Geum-yi, for your responses. So while listening to your answers, I think about my interpretations of entanglement. So yesterday, during an event, I had a chance to talk with Geum-yi. And as a reader of your book, I wondered about your Women's Diaspora trilogy, whether you had the trilogy in mind from the beginning, and I asked her that question, but she said that everything was very accidental and coincidental. When she first actually wrote the book, Can I Go Instead? She thought about how she should develop the story from the first novel, Can't I Go Instead? And then she went to write The Picture Bride. And then after writing The Picture Bride, she wanted to include more stories, and that's how The Gap of Sorrow came about. So I heard Geum-yi say and talk about this yesterday, and while re-listening to her answers, I think that there are things that writers don't imagine writing about it in the first place. And these stories tend to be developed along the way. And along the way, many entanglements can happen, and entanglements culminate into probably maybe a form. So a form is something that maybe we didn't intend or expected, and that form may bring in a lot of entanglements. Your core form can bring in about a lot of entanglements along your writing process. So I think the act of writing shapes the form of entanglement is the thought that I had while listening to your answers. And while listening to Jonas, what I can really relate to what you said is that when it comes to form, yes, of course, that we have to seek our own form, but for some, it could be a novel, for some, it could be a choreography, or for some, as for myself, it could be an essay. So when it comes to the form, I think that it could be something that you can be happy about when you're certain about what you want to write. But I think it's not the act of like filling the form, filling with the content, but I think that the destiny of a writer is going for this lifelong quest of your own core form. Now, I've asked you a few questions, and we're listening to the answers, so that will be the format that we will take for the rest of our conversation. Of course, so I think that, being reliant on these prompts prevent us from being entangled. So during the waiting room, we had a talk with Jonas that, we should not always go along the script. For example, Jonas, while listening to Kumi's answers, if something comes up in your head, and you can ask questions. That's what we talked about during the waiting room, and I think that's how the conversation today is going to be more dynamic. So I would like to also ask our writers and our guests to ask each other questions, if you have any, to each other while listening to each other's answers. Please feel free to do so, because I think the audience would find that more fun and interesting. Of course, for the interpreters, it will not be easy. And after our conversation, there will be a Q&A session with the audience. We also have people joining us from YouTube, so I'd like to ask YouTube listeners and to viewers to share your questions as well. Now, I have a question for Geum-yi. I'm sure that you've been asked this question many times in the media. But since you are attending the Seoul International Writers Festival 2025 in this new context, I would like to ask you the following question. I would like to know the initial background of planning the diaspora or women's diaspora trilogy. Even though you said that you didn't expect to do so from the beginning, but I think that from the creator's perspective, there's always this mysterious seed that budded in your mind. So I would like to ask you the question, how did you develop interest in diaspora? And it is a long historic time that you deal with in your novel. And there are so many people who go back and forth different eras and different places. So there is this aspect of time and space and all of these different elements in your novel. How did you come to think about all of these?
Yes, I'm sure that those of you who are Koreans in the audience have this experience of growing up in the only divided nation in the world. So when I was in elementary school, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, we had this very strong opposition to communism or anti-communist ideology. So when I was in elementary school, we were taught to draw anti-communist posters, and North Korea was regarded as a forbidden land. And Jonas talked about how he was taken to the library with his mother with a big IKEA bag, but when I was little, Even when we ran out of rice or food to eat, my father would bring home new books for me to read. So when I was young, we didn't really have many public libraries available or around us, or many books for children to read. But even when things got really tough in my family, my father would always buy me books, and we had like a mini library in my home. So when I was in grade 4 or 5, from that time I started reading some of the most iconic Korean writers who wrote under the Japanese colonial rule. And these novels were set in places that I could not reach, going even beyond Korea to places like China and Russia.
진짜
So, you know, I remember reading something about how North Koreans are all have red faces and horns in their heads. And I was completely shocked to read about these people who would actually travel across North Korea. So these stories actually were even more shocking than stories of Japanese brutality or historical trauma or tragedy in terms of, you know, mapping the space. And as I started reading world literature later in my teens, I began to expand my sense of space. And it was only in the late 1980s that international travel became available to the public in Korea. So I didn't really imagine that one day I'll be able to visit these foreign places that I had only encountered in books. So I created in my heart my own characters, my own figures as a young girl. So every time I read a piece of world literature, I would actually travel to these distant places, and I really enjoyed the experience. And I first dreamed of becoming a writer when I was in grade 3, and ever since, I remember thinking when I was little, one day when I become a writer, I will write a novel that is set in a very wide, unfamiliar world. And then after I made my literary debut, I wrote some children's fiction. And then at the time, for Korean writers, it was more important to portray the reality faced by children and young people in Korea. And because, you know, they only move within very limited spaces or realms, going back and forth between home and school. So I was in that kind of I pursued that kind of writing for 20 years, and then I spent one young adult fiction book a year for 10 years. So I wrote 10 titles. And I felt a little frustrated by these limitations that this kind of writing imposed on me. I had this wide, vast land that I had inside me, and I realized one day that I had to release or write about this big world in me before moving on to the next work. So like I said, I didn't set out from the start to write this trilogy about women's diaspora. I just wanted to really expand the time and space of the world that I had inside me. So the Japanese colonial era, of course, was an important part of Korean history, but rather than it being a very important historical moment, I just wanted to focus on this vast land of the land that I had not had a chance to explore, hence the title of my book, Can I Go Instead? So looking back, when I was writing that work, I was just really focused on writing about writing a story that would take me further and into a wider world. And then in the course of writing that book, Can I Go Instead, I found out about these women, so-called picture brides, so that inspired the picture bride. And then, after realizing my dream of traveling further in the book Can I Go Instead, I moved on to this other theme of motherhood and solidarity in the picture bride. And the ideas that I got in the course of writing The Picture Bride turned into my recent work, The Gap of Sorrow. So, having covered the past and the present, now I am more future-oriented, going into and looking into the future in my most recent work. So the seeds, if you like, of my novels were planted in my heart when I was a teenager. That was the impetus or the start of my trilogy, I would say. Thank you for such a moving answer. So when I come to an international festival like this, either as a moderator or a reader, I think one of the biggest perks is that you get to find out some anecdotes or stories of origin about the books that you wouldn't otherwise have known. And that takes you, I think, a step closer to the heart of the very mystery of creation. And the answer that you just shared with us about how what you have inside you, this need or this lack or this desire, sometimes inspires writing. I think it's very interesting, very fascinating indeed. Thank you for that answer. And Jonas, I imagine that you might have some questions for Geum-yi based on what she just said, but before that, I have a question for you first, and then I'll let you two talk amongst yourself. So I understand that you've been asked many times about the theme or the experience of diaspora in past interviews or book talks. Maybe it's turning into an older story for you, so I do apologize that I have to ask this question again. But seeing as this is your first time meeting with Korean readers, I'd be grateful if you could share your thoughts on diaspora, which is a central theme to your works like Montecore and I Call My Brothers. So Geum-yi's work draws on historical experiences that she did not personally experience, but your work, Montecore, seems to bring together or weave in a great deal of your generations or maybe your own experience, because there's a character, narrator is called Jonas. The narrator bears your own name. So I was actually trying very hard to make that distinction between the author and the narrator as I was reading your book. And Jonas in the book is born in 1978, which happens to be the same year of your birth. So your own lived experience of growing up in Sweden must have been reflected in specific terms in your own writing. So this kind of narrative device where the story features a character that can be mistaken for the author, I think is really interesting. So tell us a little bit about that. And this particular story is carried by two voices, Abbas, the missing man, and we have his friend, the missing man's childhood friend Kadir, and his son. And they exchange letters throughout the book. Just to give you a quick summary of the story. So in order to talk about this missing man, you employed this very interesting device of dual narrator structure. So tell us a little bit about this dual narrator structure as well.
Thank you for sharing. It's interesting to hear where the words come from. I think part of where this Montecore book came from, and all of my writing actually comes from a sense of feeling almost at home in my home country. Almost is a very important word. So I grew up in Stockholm. I was born and raised in Stockholm. My father is from Tunisia, and my mother is from Sweden. And when I was in Sweden, I felt almost at home. And when I was in Tunisia, I felt almost at home. And it made me notice the situations when I felt 100% at home a lot. And when did that happen? When did I feel at home? Well, oftentimes I felt at home when we had stories. When I remember one of the things that made me feel at home in Stockholm was that I grew up knowing that my grandfather, he built a huge bridge called the Årstabron in the area where I grew up. So he was an engineer, and he built this big bridge. And when I was young, there were moments when, due to the people I met, I felt, no, this is not my home. I don't feel at home here. I want to be elsewhere. I want to go to anywhere. I want to go to Mars. I just want to be somewhere else. But then I could go to this bridge and put my hand on the bridge and feel, no, this is my home. The physical object made me feel at home. But also the story of history and finding a link to the actual place made me feel at home. Then I had kids, and you know, as a dad, what do you do as a father? You tell them the same story again and again and again. That's part of being a parent. And very often I told them, like, look, whenever we crossed the bridge or we saw the bridge, I told my kids, look, that's the bridge. Your great-grandfather built that bridge. And then at some point, my son started asking questions about it. Like, how did he build the bridge? Like, was he alone? You know? And then I had to look up the bridge, and I realized that the bridge was actually built 5 years after my grandfather was born. So either he was a very young, talented bridge builder, like a very talented, or the story is fake. And then you could say, well, the story is made up and it's not real, so it doesn't mean anything. But it's still real, because I remember being 12 years old, having been like, you know, running away from racist skinheads who did not think that Sweden was my home, running like scared down to the bridge, putting my hand on the bridge and going like, no, this is still my home. So even though the story is made up or actually tweaked, it's actually true. It's still true. So it has an emotional truth rather than a factual truth. And then, you know, like when I looked into the story, he didn't build the bridge, but he was part of a team that put out a fire on the bridge, which is, in a way, better than building it. Like he was there present for, you know, he had a big axe and he was doing things with an axe. It's a little bit unclear what he actually did, because he was an engineer. Why would he be there? But the beautiful thing when I looked into the story was that kind of part of why this story survived was that when he had put out the fire, they asked him, his name was Bergman, Per-Olof Bergman, can we allow the trains to cross the bridge now? And he didn't know, because he was a young engineer. So he kind of looked at the bridge and like used his axe, you know, kind of like, yeah, it looks sturdy. And then he said, yeah, let the trains pass. And then he stayed on the bridge because he thought to himself, if this bridge collapses, I can just stay here because I don't have nothing to live for. And that story is much better than him building the bridge. That's what actually happened. But what I found fascinating, is when we write this talk is about entanglement. Very often I find in our lives that we are attracted to simplicity. It's a simple story. He built the bridge. But the real story is messier. He was a 22-year-old engineer with an axe trying to stop a fire. I mean, it makes no sense. But that's very often the life version. And part of why I love writing novels is that you can put both of these two things in. So in Montecore, there are two voices, and they're kind of fighting about what is the actual truth of the story. Is it the mythology or is it the life? And these two things, to separate the two, is almost impossible. And when you try to separate the two, you will find mythology popping up in real life, and you will find real life popping up in mythology. But when I think of some of the stories that I grew up hearing, I have the feeling that they actually saved my life. That I wouldn't have made it, I wouldn't have become a writer. I wouldn't sit here in Seoul talking to you without some of these stories. Again, not because they were factually true, but because they were needed at the time for us to survive.
아니, 작가님이
감사합니다.
할아버지 얘기하시니
Listening to your story about your grandfather reminded me about my grandmother. I think this storytelling gene of mine was passed down from my grandmother. She never went to school, so she didn't learn to read and write, but she was a fantastic storyteller. So she would tell me one story after another when I was little. And later in her life, she suffered from dementia. And when that happened, she got the stories that she had told me mixed up with her real lived experiences. So this was after I had grown up. So she would say, once upon a time, I was on my way home down in the countryside. I was on the bus, and a tiger jumped out of nowhere and said that he would actually devour us. And actually, at the time of when she was traveling back to her hometown, there were no buses. So according to her story, all the passengers on the bus took one shoe off each and threw the shoes outside, and decided that the victim will be chosen by the tiger when the tiger picked one of those shoes thrown outside the bus. So they would actually offer one of the passengers so that the rest of the passengers could get to the destination safely. According to my grandmother, that was what happened in real life, and she really believed that she had lived through the experience. So I was inspired to write a short story, a children's story titled A Grandmother Riding on the Back of a Tiger afterwards. So your story about how mythology got mixed up with real life in your grandfather's story, I think goes to show that you've got your storytelling gene from your grandfather.
Book that you were dedicating it to your grandmother and thanking her for the storytelling gene. I also thought of my grandmother. Both of my grandmothers were great storytellers, and one of them was a teacher in Sweden. She was like a church lady, very kind of driven and kind of a control freak. And my other grandmother in Tunisia, she was very similar. She was firm believer in Islam, but she couldn't read or write. So one of the things she would tell me whenever I went to Tunisia was, if you ever come here with Arabic, because I didn't speak Arabic, I spoke French, which is the language I grew up with. And again, it speaks to this theme. French is not only a language like any other language in Tunisia, it's the language of violence, the language of colonialism, but also the language of education to make things messy and entangled. So I would come down with French. we almost understood each other. You know that moment, like where we're kind of like, she's my grandmother, and we're kissing and hugging, and she's like half my height, so I had to lean down to hug her. But we couldn't talk the way we should talk. And then she said, if you ever come here speaking Arabic, I will give you like stories that will last you 10 books. You know. And I thought, like, that would be a good investment. Yeah, I have to learn Arabic. And then I tried again and again to learn Arabic. But every time I came down there, once I came down and I had learned the wrong kind of Arabic. I had learned like literal Arabic, and she spoke Tunisian Arabic. She was like, no, it's no good. So there was also this idea that you know, we often think that if we learn the right words, we can come close. But sometimes there are other things standing in the way of closeness. Maybe it's tradition, maybe it's class, maybe it is just physical distance. So she was both of them. Her name was Yamina, and my Swedish grandmother was Gudrun. And both of them have also, I've kind of honored them by putting their names in at times in my work.
네, 두 분 대화.
Thank you very much for that conversation. It's very interesting. And in my head, I think about my grandpa and grandma, but they passed away so early. And I'm thinking to myself, why nobody has given me that literary DNA? But anyways, while listening to your conversations, I think that it's very much in line with the next question that I want to ask you about language. So the diasporic experience about diaspora, I think is the essence of moving to another place away from your hometown. So as your body moves to another place, your life and your culture changes, but also the language of your destination place. You have to be accustomed to that language and culture, but all that process is very challenging. So in that process, you can be frustrated, and you may have had only one mother tongue, but with all of these different languages coming inside of you, there is an opening of more entanglements in your life as well. So, in The Picture Bride of Geum-yi, when I read the book, at first I was quite surprised because it starts from Busan dialect of Korea, and from the beginning and up until the end, there is a woman who is considered as a picture bride and who goes to the Hawaii to work on a farm and to get married with overseas Korean men in Hawaii. But how they get married is through this picture of the brides. So in the beginning, she leaves Busan to go to Hawaii, but there are all of these different languages that come along the way. And I was born and raised in Seoul, so everything in my life is very much centered on the metropolitan area. And through this medium of book, I felt like I could see the world and my surrounding being completely turned upside down, which was very much focused on the metropolitan area. And also in the Montecore of Jonas, language is a very important element as well. And here, Jonas' mother is Swedish, father is Tunisian, and Abbas, the father, when young, actually suffered from mutism earlier on. But as he became an adult, he became fluent in different languages, and he went around the Tunisian tourist destinations to welcome different tourists. So he became very fluent in English and French. But after marrying a Swedish woman, he moves to Sweden. But he has to learn Swedish, but faces some challenges. And the son, Jonas, of course, is very fluent in Swedish, and he also invents sort of like based on his language book. And I think that, so he makes the Swedish rule book or language rule book and gives it to the father's friend, and so forth. So while reading this book, Montecore, what really struck me was this character, Abbas Khemiri, the father, so who was born in Tunisia, suffers from mutism, becomes fluent in English and French, moves to Sweden, and then has to learn Swedish. So he invents his own language called Khemiris or Khemirian to communicate with his son. So I want to actually recite some of the lines of the book, but for the constraint of time, I'm not going to do so. So if you haven't actually read the book yet, I would like to invite our audience to read this book. So with regards to this Khemirian, I would like to know about your thoughts. So how did you come about in bringing these elements? And does Khemiris really exist?
So what happened was that my mom and my father, they fell in love.
네.
But it was not logical love, because love is never logical, right?
모든 사랑이 논리적이진 않은 것 같습니다.
That's true, not logical.
So the logical thing would be for them to fall in love with someone who maybe shared the same language, who had shared the same history, who shared the same skin color, or culture, or religion, but they fell in love with someone who was very different than they were. And it created a situation where a lot of people around them looked at them and thought that their love wasn't real, that their love was like made up. Or so what they had to do, this is my interpretation, they had to create a wall against the outside world as a defense to survive. They made up their own language. So when I grew up, they would speak French, Swedish, Arabic, English, Spanish. I mean, it would just be a mix of languages. But what I found fascinating as a kid was that I could always know, like, based on what language they spoke, I knew how happy they were, for example, because they fell in love en français, in French. So if they spoke French, it meant that they were very happy, And to this day, whenever I speak French. So like whenever I speak French, I feel happier, even though I'm very sad. There's something about that language that oui, but it's just le son, the sound of French makes me happy, and it's linked to my history because they spoke French when they were happy. But we can never take away our word choices from a political dimension, from a power hierarchy. And one of the things that I think turned me into a writer was that I also saw how people around us reacted once you made a mistake in language. Once you made like a grammatical mistake, and one of the things that my dad often talks about was that I want your language to be parfait, like perfect. And as you know, if you're writing from a position of perfectionism, it is impossible to write. So my books are full of everything that I couldn't do in real life. I went to university, I studied, I was perfect, but I couldn't write from that perspective. So my books are the place where I can play, where I can invent, where I can make up words. And part of that joy comes from using language as almost like an emergency exit, or as maybe as a defense mechanism. Maybe I use language in the same way that my mother and father used language, as a wall to the outside world. So the Khemiri language in Swedish is called Khemiriska. Like that was a thing that we joked about, that it was the mix of all these languages and an attempt to create our own identity. But right now, I have the experience of being an actual diaspora writer, because I live in the United States since 4 years ago. I moved 4 years ago. So now I teach in English, not my mother tongue, and I also write in English, not my mother tongue. And one of the things that I find amazing about that is that all of a sudden I see what I love about Swedish. to kind of write in English, I see that language. I love English too, but English for me is like a huge language. There's so many words in English. The vocabulary is huge. There's so many. It feels sometimes writing in English feels like going to, what do you call, like an all-inclusive buffet, where there's like food everywhere, like a breakfast buffet. Like I can't see the end of it. It's just like tables and tables and tables, and like buckets of sauce. Like a lot of just, just like endless amounts of food, because there's so much. You could just take anything you want. And then I write both in English and Swedish. When I go back to Swedish, it's a completely different restaurant. It's very quiet. And in Swedish, we have very few words. So there's no all-inclusive buffet, no sauce. It's just like very elegant, and maybe one course, like very, very few words. It's a completely different experience. But part of why I love this process. So my latest book, The Sisters, I wrote it in English and then in Swedish and in English. But every time I went back and forth between the languages, I could see what it is about that particular language that I love. And part of the thing that I love about Swedish is that we have few words, but they can mean very different things. So this is going to be hard for the interpreters, but for example, like we have a word like, I would say like, tomten stod på tomten. Good luck. So in Swedish, tomten means Santa Claus. Santa Claus. Who gives up
아스트리드 린드그렌의 그 톰튼.
Tomten, Santa Claus. Tomten means a plot of land. So exactly the same word. Tomten, stod på tomten, means the Santa Claus stood on the plot of land. But they sound very similar. So that's like the just to see, it's just two different ways of working that expands my sense of freedom. But those are the only two languages that I could write in. I couldn't write in French or Arabic.
네. 너무
So that's a very interesting story. Yes, Tomten, Astrid Lindgren, in her children's book, I heard about that. Tomten in her book. So the Khemiri language, when it's translated into Korean, there are like Arabic, French, Spanish, Swedish, and also very elegant Swedish, but also, street Swedish, the Swedish that's spoken by young people on the streets. So all of that is very much mixed in Khemiri's. But as it is translated into Korean, I was afraid that the meanings could not be fully interpreted into Korean. But I believe that that is actually not the case when I listen to your answer, because Korean will be included in the original Khemiri's, so that there will be more entanglements happening through the translation process as well. So as for the translation as well, it will further expand the diasporic elements of the words. Now, regarding the picture bride of Geum-yi, you also said that, or I believe that the language is a very important element in that book. And there is the Gyeongnam dialect that is used, but when the picture brides arrive in Hawaii and meet with the future grooms, their homelands are like Pyongan province, so somewhere in North Korea. So we can see all of these different dialects that are mixed in your novel as well. But the Gyeongnam novel dialect is very distinctive. So I thought that your hometown is Busan, but I was quite surprised that your hometown is Chungcheong province. So I wonder if there were no difficulty in writing all of these different dialects. Maybe it was very like a foreign language to you.
어떤 막 깊은
So yes, a lot of thought went into creating the Khemirian language, but as for me, use of the Gyeongnam or southern dialect was for a very simple reason. It was based on historical records of real picture brides most of them had come from those provinces down in south of Korea. So I wanted to stay true to the historical facts. Like you said, I am from Chungcheong province in the Midlands of Korea, so I didn't really have much to do with the southern dialect, but I kind of trained myself on page. I watched lots of films with characters speaking the particular dialect, and I looked up a dictionary as well of the southern dialect and asked around. So I just thought that I had no other choice but to write in that dialect and that Yeongnam dialect. We have this standard Korean, which is very soul-centered, and the fact that these people use this southern dialect means that they are marginalized in society. And when they move to Hawaii, they continue to live the lives of outsiders and minorities. And Bodil, one of the protagonists in my character novel, thinks that she can study and go to school in Hawaii, and that's why she chooses to go to Hawaii. But once she gets there, she has to get married, she gives birth, and then once her husband leaves, she has to look after the household. So she has no time really or peace of mind to pick up the language, the local language. And the women, the picture brides, form a community and live together or close to each other. And they weren't so much trying very hard to maintain the language, rather they didn't really have an opportunity to lose it in the first place. And I think the language that you speak takes you right back to your roots. So it was a way of their holding on to their roots as well. So a lot became entangled in their use of Yeongnam dialect, but primarily it was to really stay true to the historical facts. Yes. So I do have quite a few questions left on my list, but we have actually we've spent quite a lot of time already. So I think we should take some questions perhaps from the audience, from the floor. I actually have a question for Jonas, if you don't mind. When I was reading Montecore, one of the narrators bears your own name, and when it's very rare to come across a writer who gives their characters their own name. And even when they do, they create an entirely fictional character, or a character that's very different from who they are in real life. And I thought, reading Montecore, that this was a very brave decision on your part as a writer to put yourself or put a character bearing your name on the forefront. And as our moderator said, it was very difficult to draw the distinction between where fiction ends and where reality begins. So as a writer, I'm quite curious to know, when you write a novel that is rather autobiographical and write a character who bears your name, how do you maintain or create a distance between yourself and the character that you've created? And also, do you ever feel the need or urge to defend that character with your own name? So I had this question in my head the whole time.
Spending time with Jonas in the book. I think part of what I try to do is to make sure that the book is more important than I am. I don't really care about me, but I really care about the book. And that's something that I tell my students as well. Oftentimes when I meet them the first time, like I say, I care less about you than I care about your work, like the actual text. And what I try to say is like I don't really care about like one of the ways that I use my name, in many of my books, there is a character named Jonas. The weird thing is that he keeps changing. He's never the same person. So what if the way that we label the world, the way that we try to define the world, what if those words that we use can't be trusted? What if the names, not even the names, if we can't trust the names, if we can't trust the words, I think that there's a potential for freedom in some sense. So I think that's one of the reasons why I like using Jonas. In almost all my book, there's like one character called Jonas, or Jonas, or Jonas, or Yunus in Arabic. But he keeps changing. So it's a way for me to keep writing fiction. I don't see it as autofiction as much as an attempt to continuously try to defend the act of storytelling. Some of the autofiction I find to try to condemn storytelling. They end up with with a feeling of like, no, there's nothing left to tell. And I'm the opposite. There will never be a situation where we run out of stories. Never. So I want to keep telling stories, and I keep filling that name with potential identities. I think that could be one way of looking at it. And in my new book, The Sisters, there's a Jonas in there too. Yeah, but he's very, very different. Yeah, he's very neurotic and different. Yeah, much less angry than Jonas in the Montecore. Yeah.
기대하겠습니다.
Yeah.
예, 답변 고맙습니다.
Thank you for your answer. I look forward to reading your other works in Korean. That was such a fascinating question followed by a fascinating answer. And I've learned a lot as well. Many thanks to your question and answer. So what about you, Jonas? Have you got any questions perhaps for Geum-yi?
Curious about the title of your last book. I thought that was beautiful. And I wonder where the title came from.
감사합니다.
Thank you so much. The Gap of Sorrow, or the Crevice of Sorrow, is about Korean diaspora people living in Sakhalin. During the Japanese colonial era, they were forced to move to this place called Sakhalin in Russia, and they were forced into labor. And after the end of the World War II, after liberation of Korea, they stayed in that part of Russia, so they could not return to their homeland for the next 50 years. And because we didn't have any diplomatic ties between Korea and Russia, they didn't really have a chance to come back. And we now have second, third generations of Korean diaspora population living in the same part of Russia. And of course, they had some hardships in their lives and struggles, but even within that, they were resilient and they very much took on the challenge head on and found moments of joy and hope. And what they wanted more than anything was not pity, but respect and consolation. And that's what I wanted to offer to those people. Hence the title, Gap of Sorrow, or Crevice in Sorrow. Thank you. Thank you so much for the exchange. We only have about 10 minutes left, I'm afraid. We've got some questions. We can take some questions from our YouTube viewers, or you can take some questions from our audiences. We've had some questions actually beforehand. So we have one question that goes to both of our writers, and it says, your works feel as though they hold in them an entire era of each of your countries. You know, it can be said about the work of Geum-yi, and in Montecore, we have a sweeping narrative spanning the 1980s and 90s. So, in writing about these specific periods, in history or moments in time, what have you found to be most difficult challenges? Who would like to go first?
One of the reasons, I mean, I totally agree with that question of like trying to, I think that oftentimes I write about periods where there is one official narrative, and I try to allow my books to complicate that narrative, to say that there is, you know, there's an idea of my home country as being democratic and open and perfect in a way, and then I can write stories that complicate that image. And a lot of the books, I mean, I thought about that when I read your work as well, that I really appreciated. A lot of the books that I love, they have, it's almost like they try to subvert an official version of truth. Yeah, and someone like Svetlana Alexievich has been incredibly important for me, where there is an official idea of what a country is or should be, and then she appears and says, wait, I have some other testimonials here that makes your truth a lot more complicated. And I think that's what I aspire to do in my books as well.
As for me, so historical facts or historical categorization, I try to find some crevices or gaps in those narratives. And I mostly depict the time and space that I have not myself experienced. So in the beginning, in the early days, it was really difficult for me to explore the realm of imagination. And I really enjoyed the whole process of bringing in fiction into the historical narrative, but the details, like if people sat down for a meal, what would they have for side dishes? What would their spoons look like? So I had to go back to historical records and do my research. And if they went on a day trip, then what would they see outside the window? Because the landscape would have looked completely different. And of course, I would look. There are some remaining historical records, but they are only limited. So I really struggled to let my imagination fly in the start, which was very time-consuming for me. And I came to a realization one day that historical fiction, like science fiction or fantasy fiction, requires imagination. Writing historical fiction requires imagination, just like science fiction. So, with that in mind, I decided to really let my imagination take flight. And my character in my first novel, meets some very famous, well-known historical figures like Kyung, the independent movement activist. So, Kyung meets Sunam, and what they exchange is complete fabrication on my part. And this is actually based on my research into the biography of Kim-gu, or stories and essays on Kim-gu as well. And I just found this immense sense of joy. I really enjoyed the whole process. And that led me to write The Picture Bride. And really expanding and tapping into imagination within the historical space became easier for me and, of course, more enjoyable. Thank you so much.
Now we're going to share the questions. We just heard the answers to the questions that were received in advance. So for the remaining time of our conversation, I would like to ask our audience to share any questions or any comments. So please feel free to raise your hands to ask your questions directly to our writers. If you have any questions, please raise your hand.
You just mentioned that when writing is adapted into a film or TV, it have risks becoming flat. So if Montecore were ever adapted to the screen, what part of the story or the voices would you be most afraid of losing?
Wow, that's a beautiful question. Thank you so much. they tried. And I think it's one of those books. So I meet a lot of young people who are writing, and a lot of them, they think, well, the whole point of writing is for me to write a book that then can be turned into a movie, turned into Netflix, and then one day they will sit with Oprah Winfrey and be happy, you know. But what if that's not the goal? What if the goal of a writer is to write something that is impossible to move to another form? I find that quite inspiring to think about the reason why this story exists in this book form. My job as a writer is to make sure that, to let you know as a potential reader, that this story has to appear in this specific form. So to be honest, I think it would be very hard to transform it into a movie. And that's part of what I like, that's part of the strength of the book. Does that make sense? So like if you're writing, if you have this idea or you want to write something, try to think in the opposite direction. What story could the reader only appreciate in a book form? And think less about Oprah and Netflix. It's actually much easier to write if you think of a story that needs the book in order to exist. But thank you very much.
네, 저기 님께서도 질문이 있으십니다.
Now I think there's another question in the front row. Thank you so much, Geum-yi and Jonas. I have a question for Geum-yi. So when it comes to the history of migration, it is written in many forms in the novel, but in your novels, most of the characters are women and they are quite young in age. So these young women had been hidden in the history of diaspora and migration, and I came to learn through your novels that they were indeed many in great numbers. So I would like to know why women as characters. Not very difficult to answer because I am woman. And of course, nowadays we talk a lot about women's issues and so forth, but there are lots of hidden narratives of women that we have to uncover. And I also write books for children and youth, young people. So my first readers, I always consider them to be the young people. Of course, it's good that the adults also read my books as well. So I try to always be considerate of these generation and their age when writing my book, so that my book can be also read by them. Now, it seems like we have 5 minutes left, so maybe we can take one more question or last question from the person behind. I have a question for both of you. It could be a very lighthearted question. You're a writer, but you also teach creative writing. Now, as for a student who is attending your class for the first time in creative writing, what do you tell them in your first day class? And so this is the question that is addressed to both of you. What would you say, or what do you say?
I just met my students for the first time on September 2nd. And one of the things I told them during our first class was I looked at them and said, "Are you here?" Are you here? Are you present? And they kind of went, But are you here? Like, do you actually hear me now? And they said, yes, we hear you because we hear your voice. And then I said, prove it. Prove that you're present. That's my main thing that I'm practicing with my students and also with myself. Right now, there are so many forces trying to pull us away from being present. It's part of why I love being here with you in the same space, is that we are actually present here, and you hear my voice, and we share physical space. Our phones are doing that. Everything is pulling us away from the present moment. And part of the reason why I love writing books and why I love reading books is the books that I love, they make me feel very present in the story that is not real. So my life is going on outside here, But when I read the work of Duras or Tolstoy or like some of my favorite writers, I feel that the world on the page is actually more real than whatever is going on outside. So the main question is, how can we create presence? And one of the reasons and the theme of today is using our senses, using our vision. So it could be using the fact that we can see each other, we can listen to each other, we can incorporate our sense of smell. But the main thing is to remember that oftentimes the writing that I love, it's specific and it involves your senses, and it forces me to do less of, just being addicted to my phone, because it creates presence through the use of language. So that's what I'm practicing. And I find that when I teach the thing that I need to learn, that's when my classes go. Then I'm the best teacher for them, and also I learn something from teaching. And thank you.
Yes. I used to once also teach creative writing for students, and I think I've emphasized about the joy of creativity, creation. And of course, during that entire process, it could be frustrating. There are lots of challenges along the way, but all of those actually are included, or should be included in your process of creative writing. So I tell the students, or I used to tell students that if your writing is only 100% painful, then if you cannot actually write or enjoy writing, then maybe it's better for you to, just stay as a reader and live your life as a reader. I used to tell that to my students. Of course, because we write because we love the experience. And if we can also embrace the hardships along the way, that is something that we have to remember as writers, or anyone who writes. Thank you very much, Geum-yi and Jonas, for your answers, and thank you, the audience, for your very interesting questions. Yes, so time really flies. 1 hour and 30 minutes have passed already. I'm quite surprised. So we are almost nearing the end of today's conversation. So I would like to turn it over to our guests for their last comment before we wrap up. Shall I start?
Thank you all very much for joining us and listening to our conversation today. And my next work is going to be about an adaptee to Sweden. So it's very special for me to have this conversation with a Swedish author. And it really empowers me to write that novel, and it's a great honor. So many thanks indeed to Jonas, and many thanks once again to all of you present here today. I hope you enjoy the rest of the festival period and enjoy autumn as well.
Great honor to be here. I really enjoy this, and thank you to you too. It's been a real eye-opening conversation. I really enjoyed this talk. If I'm going to leave you with something, I recently met a writer friend, and we talked about writing and death, because that's what we do, and what kind of books that we want to write before we die, basically. And then she sent me a quote by the American writer, David Foster Wallace, who is no longer alive, unfortunately. And it's a long quote. It's from his book, Brief Interviews with Hideous Men. But I'm just going to give you that, there was something about that quote. I'm not going to quote it verbatim. But he says that what separates kind of art that survives and okay art, sometimes I think that we think that as a creative person, in order to write well, you have to write to get the love of the readers, to reach for the love, to try to, And basically what he says in this quote is like, the books that he loves, the stories that he loves, the movies that survive, ultimately they're not trying to get the love, they're trying to show the love. They try to show, and the books that I love, they have that ability. The creative person who is creating them, it's almost like their heart is able to love everyone involved in the book. And that's what I aspire to do in my writing. So I really, you can find, I'm sure you can find that quote easily online. But rather than reaching for love, try to actually show love in your work. And I think that's the best creative practice that you can do it. It's also much harder. You know, the idea that you're reaching for love, you're also constantly dependent on the love of other people. But the act of showing love is interior. You can do that. You can start now. It's much, spoiler alert, it's much harder to do in life than in your creative practice. But you can start now to try to practice it. And I'm not there yet, but I'm trying.
네, 두 분 말씀.
Thank you so much for this insightful conversation. I would like to say a few more words, but seeing as we have run out of time, I'm going to have to save it for a later conversation. There will be a quick signing session afterwards, so if you'd like to get your book signed, please remain seated and we will make some arrangements. And on your way out, you'll find the QR code for our satisfaction survey, so please do take part. It will help us create better programs in the future. Many thanks once again to our audience members. Many thanks to all our wonderful authors. That's it from me. Thank you.